The threat of cybercrime sparking growing concern across the country. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
And I'm Jenna Browder. No one is immune. That is the message security experts are sending as an increasing number of cyber attacks dominate headlines.
High-tech warfare is here, and often the United States is the prime target. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke has more in tonight's top story.
The recent wave of attacks using ransomware serve as sobering reminders. No industry is off limits, and no protection is bulletproof.
There are two types of companies out there: those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know, but they've all been hacked.
Recent targets include a global meat producer, a key gas pipeline, hospitals, and dozens of government agencies.
We're not talking about people with conscience. We're talking about criminals who want to make money illegally, or who want to do harm independent of a profit motive.
In a ransomware attack, hackers gain access to a computer system and disrupt or completely lock out users until a ransom is paid. Historically, private companies pay the money quickly and quietly. For other victims, that's not always an option.
Cities and government, I really don't think that we're in a position to negotiate with a ransomer or pay ransoms. That is just not something that we are really able to do, nor could we afford.
Kimberly LeGroux is the Chief Information Officer for the City of New Orleans. In early 2020, she led a complete infrastructure rebuild after hackers attacked and the city refused to pay the ransom.
We built those things back stronger. It did not mean that that our systems in whole were destroyed. It just meant that if we were going to really address this and tackle this problem of cybersecurity and safety, that we were going to just start with a fresh and very clean environment.
As with many attacks, the hackers likely gained access through either outdated infrastructure or a user not taking appropriate precautions.
Those legacy systems had their own holes, and we were constantly patching them and constantly modernizing other areas. And to have over 4,000 employees, we have every one of them as a point of vulnerability into our network.
The attack on New Orleans had the capability to completely interrupt or halt government operations. Fortunately, response teams had planned for that type of disaster.
You have to know where your vulnerabilities are. You have to have a consistent plan, a continuous plan to update and modernize those things. And that's what we were doing, and we have been doing for years. So every year we were devoting another part of our budget to infrastructure improvements.
Those plans allowed LeGroux's team to move quickly with money from its cyber insurance policy to further update and secure systems. Still, LeGroux says the city must remain vigilant.
I can't say that we won't be subject to some type of ransom attack again. That is just not feasible.
Security expert Frank Gaffney has raised flags about critical infrastructure vulnerabilities for decades, specifically our power grid. He says that threat goes way beyond these ransom-style attacks.
We have in our electric grid at the moment, by some estimates, as many as 200 to 300 Chinese-manufactured transformers. What could possibly go wrong, as they say? And were those to be shut down, presumably at the command of people in Beijing, the effect of that could be really catastrophic for the national security.
With this recent wave of attacks, Gaffney hopes action will finally be taken to harden the grid and protect other critical infrastructure. Action he believes could ultimately save the lives of tens of millions of Americans.
My persistent prayer has been that I'm wrong about these various challenges to our country, to our economy, yes, but to our security, to our people. I take no pleasure in being vindicated, and I will be particularly devastated if the warnings, mostly unheeded, about our electric grid's vulnerabilities are exploited by one or more of these enemies who understand them.
The reality is America is under attack from a number of sides, and it's the very connectivity we rely on every day that makes us most vulnerable. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Thank you, Caitlin. Well, Elizabeth Newman is a counterterrorism expert and former Department of Homeland Security official. I recently asked her about the rise in ransomware attacks and what it means for America's national security.
Well, we're seeing a pretty significant increase in attacks. Last year, it was over a 300% increase of ransomware attacks alone. Now, ransomware traditionally has been seen as a criminal activity, and it is still perpetrated by criminal enterprises, people looking to make money. But what we've noticed in the last year with the targeting of hospitals during the middle of COVID and then our energy supply, our food supply, is that they are quite able to disrupt our way of life. And that brings with it concerns that you're going to impact not only our economic security, but also potentially our national security, because certainly our military and national security apparatus are reliant on energy and fuel just like the rest of Americans are. So it is this growing concern, and you've seen the government respond accordingly.
You know, when it comes to ransomware, should the United States consider itself under attack?
Absolutely. We've been under attack. And I think the thing that the recent attacks are allowing security experts to get the message out. I mean, it's been like 2 decades that this has been warned that there will be a day when the lights will go out, and it won't be because of a storm. It won't be because you forgot to pay your energy bill. It's because somebody somewhere across the world decided with a keystroke to be able to turn off the lights. And that capability, we've known it was in our future. And I would say for about the last 7 to 8 years, we have seen it be able to be demonstrated. It's just a matter of time before it happens here. So we need to take seriously this threat.
How do we fight against cyber attacks?
That's a great question. So the defense is certainly a key piece of this, making sure that we are doing what we need to do to have our systems secured, being a good computer user, meaning you have that 2-factor authentication where you're not only using a password but some other means to also validate that you are who you say you are, making sure that your systems are backed up. You know, we call that cyber hygiene. Having good cyber hygiene goes a long way, but we need to do more than that. We need to make sure we have backups to our systems so that if a system is attacked, we can move to manual processes and not disrupt whatever service that company was providing. And then more than that, we need to create pressure on either the nation states or the criminal actors that are conducting these attacks and make it more costly for them. The challenge with the cyber attack is it's actually relatively low cost to launch and extremely difficult to secure against. So it's high cost to protect. So we need to increase the cost on the attacker. And there are a number of cyber companies, experts in this field that are doing a great job. It's just a matter of now we need to make sure that the entire ecosystem, not just, for example, the banks, are secure. And that's going to take a whole of society effort. And I would say the last piece in increasing that cost is more offensive cyber measures, which I know the federal government has talked about doing. You've heard President Biden kind of allude to the desire to make sure that the criminal attackers as well as nation-state attackers know that if you're going to mess with us, we have the ability to mess with you.
Elizabeth Newman, thank you so much for your time. Great to get your insights.
Lights out on America's power supply, the cyber threat that could plunge the country into darkness when Faith Nation returns.
Welcome back. For years, there's been concern over what happens if North Korea obtains a nuclear weapon. But in this high-tech age, Pyongyang has a weapon that could spell disaster for America's digital infrastructure, a so-called superweapon that could annihilate our electric grid.
That's right, Jenna. Hackers are just keystrokes away from sending our cities into darkness and fry our nation's power supply. So what can be done to protect the homeland? CBN's George Thomas explains.
From natural phenomena to cyber hacks, like the massive SolarWinds operation and recent attack to the Colonial gas pipeline, security experts warn it's clear that most businesses and key infrastructure, like power grids across this country, are woefully unprepared to meet such threats.
They went after our gas and they went after our hot dogs. No one is out of bounds here. Everyone is in play.
Lawmakers like Senator Bob Hall of Texas also worry that means hackers could be just a few keystrokes away from turning the lights out in cities around our country.
We are certainly vulnerable across the board to natural and man-made threats to our electrical grid system that could render it unrepairable in our lifetime.
Hall tells CBN News that he's especially concerned about an electronic magnetic pulse, or EMP, attack against the grid.
It entails simply one small nuclear weapon being detonated above the central part of the United States over Nebraska, Kansas area would put out create a pulse from coast to coast and border to border that would totally annihilate our electric system.
There's really no excuse for the country to be vulnerable to EMP.
Dr. Peter Pry, a former CIA intelligence officer, sits on the Department of Homeland Security's EMP task force. He's out with a report this week concluding that North Korea is now in possession of EMP weapons so strong that no electric grid could survive from such an attack.
North Korea almost certainly has developed super EMP weapons. These are nuclear weapons that are specialized to produce extraordinarily powerful electromagnetic pulse effects. And it would make it, along with Russia and China, one of the few nations in the world that has these weapons.
San Antonio, Texas is now leading the nation's efforts to defend against such electromagnetic threats. In collaboration with the Air Force's Joint Base San Antonio, retired Brigadier General Guy Walsh, along with teams of researchers, scientists, and security experts, are studying grid vulnerabilities and deploying measures to protect them from getting fried. For obvious security reasons, Walsh won't divulge specifics, but says their goal is
to really look across the board at training, at education, and the technologies that are going to help make the electrical grid both resilient to attack, but able to recover more quickly.
Meanwhile, grid operators in some regions of the country are also heeding warnings to prepare for solar storms and sunspots blasting particles into space called coronal mass ejections. William Murtaugh's group at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, maintains a direct line with all the electric companies in the event of a geomagnetic eruption.
When we see one of these large eruptions occurring on the sun and what we call a coronal mass ejection coming towards Earth, we initiate this hotline call and we make communication with essentially the entire grid, owners and operators across the nation.
Researchers with the U.S. Geological Survey released this map last year showing grid systems in the Midwest and Eastern Seaboard that are particularly vulnerable to solar storms. Murtaugh says electricity operators are now constantly assessing areas of vulnerability.
If there's vulnerability to certain equipment, maybe they can modify that equipment, the manufacturing of that equipment, to make it hardened, to make it better protected against the geomagnetic storm. There are many different actions they can take to ensure that the grid stays up and running during these big geomagnetic storms.
Still, the big challenge is that many of America's electricity systems weren't designed or built with the thought of being protected against cyber threats or EMP attacks.
The systems themselves are very antiquated. They're very old. Security is very difficult to do on these types of devices. And we've seen in prior attacks where Russia has infiltrated our power grid from a military preparedness perspective, which means in the event that there is a conflict, could Russia impact our grid?
Former NSA hacker David Kennedy tells CBN News that only a few of them are even prepared to handle today's level of hacking sophistication, especially those attacks coming from China.
China is very pressing because they have a very long-term view. They're very focused on intellectual property theft, as well as their military capabilities from a cyber warfare perspective. I mean, they're handing it to us here in the United States from a cyber warfare perspective, and they're definitely scary.
The energy industry is the third most targeted sector for cyber criminals, behind only finance and manufacturing. And according to the Energy Department, hackers have the capability to shut down America's power grid.
There are very malign actors who are trying, even as we speak. There are thousands of attacks on all aspects of the energy sector and the private sector generally.
A new survey this week from the nonpartisan group Protect Our Power found a majority of people support federal funding to secure our nation's electric grid ahead of potential catastrophe.
It so often is the case when we face challenges or threats on the horizon, we're better off dealing with it before it hits as opposed to after it hits.
George Thomas, CBN News.
A master of crime helps to catch the criminals. Meet the former con man who's helping stop high-tech crime. Next.
Download the CBN News app, 24/7 news from a Christian perspective at home or on the road. One place for all of your news. Breaking news alerts. Set daily prayer goals and pray for news stories. Read the most important news and watch CBN News Channel live. CBN News, because truth matters. Go to cbnnewsapp.com to get the app today.
Well, welcome back. Frank Abagnale, you may have heard his name in Steven Spielberg's hit movie Catch Me If You Can, a film based on his unbelievable outlaw past.
Abagnale used to be one of the world's most famous con men, and now he uses what he learned during his life of crime to help catch high-tech criminals. Mark Martin reports.
I'd like to cash this check here, and then I'd like to take you out for a steak dinner.
Leonardo DiCaprio played former con man Frank Abagnale in a 2000 film, Catch Me If You Can.
I can't stop. It's my job.
Tom Hanks plays the FBI agent who finally tracked down the 21-year-old Abagnale in France after a 5-year crime spree.
I ran away from home when I was 16, basically because my parents were getting a divorce and a judge in family court was making me choose which parent to live with. So I chose to run away instead.
He admits life on the run was by no means glamorous, regularly crying himself to sleep.
I started writing checks to support myself. When money ran out, I kept writing the checks. I impersonated an airline pilot for a couple of years. I worked in a hospital as a doctor for a while. I took the bar in Louisiana and practiced law there for a while. And by the time I was 21, I'd written about $2.5 million worth of bad checks in 26 countries and 50 states.
Nearly 50 years later, part of life involves being the face of AARP's Fraud Watch network. He speaks on avoiding scams and ways to protect families from crimes, including identity theft.
Abagnale has served as AARP's Fraud Watch network ambassador for 4 years now. He shares his criminal past and turnaround with audiences and also talks about potential pitfalls created by criminals in today's high-tech world.
Life on the other side began after the pursuing FBI agent rescued Abagnale from a federal prison in Virginia. The movie character's name is Carl Hanratty. In real life, it was Joseph Shea.
He persuaded the government that he felt that I would be a great asset to the government if they took me out of prison to basically not only help educate agents to think out of the box and to look at things not as black and white, but also to do undercover work for the Bureau because I could take on these roles as different people and get enough time doing it to get enough information.
After 6 years, Abagnale was free to leave the FBI. He chose to stay and has worked for the Bureau for more than 40 years. Abagnale credits those close to him for helping him turn his life around.
So it was more about my wife changing my life and my family and the responsibility of family, and then learning the love of country and being surrounded by people who influence you as a young person is what really changed my life.
Today, Abagnale teaches at the FBI Academy, trains agents in the field, and assists agents on cases. He's also an author, public speaker, and consultant. His website describes him as one of the world's most respected authorities on forgery, embezzlement, and secure documents.
Last 20 years all been cyber-related, about breaches and cyber crimes and malware, ransomware, and those things.
He says a few years ago, AARP contacted him about sharing ways to protect the elderly from fraud. A survey showed fraud as the #1 concern for the organization's more than 38 million members.
The actual incidence of fraud and ID theft, fraud mostly,
it's drastically underreported because someone feels vulnerable and they don't want to admit it. Having people come together makes people realize, I'm not in this alone. And one of the first steps to being able to remedy the situation is to admit that it happened.
Abagnale says people should know that every scam is basically the same.
At some point in that conversation, I'm going to either ask you for money or I'm going to ask you for information, Social Security number, date of birth, bank account number. Those are the red flags.
He adds each scam is simple to solve by what he calls stop and verify.
So if I call and say I'm the IRS and you owe back taxes and you need to pay immediately right this minute, I just hang up the phone and go to the white pages and look up the IRS, or go to the government pages and look up the IRS, call the IRS that I received this call, this is a person's name, and they're going to tell me that's a scam, ignore the call.
Abagnale says education is the most powerful weapon in fighting crime, and this former con artist has chosen to spend his life on the right side of the law, sharing that knowledge. Mark Martin, CBN News, Virginia Beach.
Thank you, Mark. Coming up, how to keep you and your personal information safe in the age of cybercrime.
Young people, millennials, are flocking to church.
It's not an exaggeration to say that we love to meet them and that we love to know their stories.
Finally tonight, if you read the headlines, you may think cyber attacks just affect businesses who can pay out big ransoms. But experts warn everyone is at risk.
That's right. And believe it or not, hackers aren't just after your money. They're also after something just as valuable, your data. To keep yourself safe from cyber criminals, there are a few simple steps you can take. Experts say opt for extra protection. While most computers do come with some standard security systems, buying a third-party malware program is worth the cost. Also, remember to update often. That way you can have the latest security patches to protect yourself and be aware of what you're clicking on. If a link or email looks suspicious, it's probably best just to avoid it and hit delete. All good information.
Yeah, I will admit, sometimes I don't update quite as often as I should, but...
Guilty as well.
Have a great night.